I want you to look closely at the images flooding your screens today from the Taiwan Strait because you are witnessing something that military historians will be analyzing for the next century. They are calling it Operation Justice Mission 2025, but look past the official titles and the hysterical breaking news banners. What you are seeing is not just a blockade, it is the precise moment the American empire officially ran out of road. For decades, Washington has operated on the arrogant assumption that it could dictate the security architecture of the entire planet from the safety of a continent away. But today, that delusion has shattered against a wall of steel and strategy. The centerpiece of this operation isn't even the warships, it is the civilian armada. Thousands of fishing vessels, cargo ships, and ferries, effectively a shadow navy, have swarmed the strait, weaving between military hulls, making it impossible for the U.S. Navy to intervene without firing on civilians. This is a checkmate in the real world. A terrifying innovation in asymmetric warfare that renders the multi-billion-dollar American aircraft carriers obsolete before they even leave port. This is not a sudden aggression. It is a calculated, inevitable retaliation to the single most reckless act of diplomatic sabotage we have seen in modern history. I am talking about the record-breaking $11.1 billion arms deal signed by Washington just days ago. The establishment in D.C. sold this deal to the public as a defense package to protect democracy. That is a lie. When you look at the manifest HIMARS, long-range drones, offensive missile systems, you realize this wasn't aid, it was an eviction notice. The United States knew exactly what it was doing. They were crossing a red line that Beijing has drawn in bold ink for 70 years. Why? Because the American hegemon does not know how to negotiate. It only knows how to escalate. It operates on a doctrine of systemic hypocrisy that is breathtaking in its scale. Think back to the Monroe Doctrine. For 2 centuries, the United States has claimed the entire Western Hemisphere as its backyard, overthrowing governments in Chile, invading Panama, and strangling Cuba, all under the justification that no foreign power is allowed to operate near American borders. Yet today they stand in indignation that a superpower like China would demand the same security for its own coastline. It is the ultimate double standard rules for thee, but not for me. But history has a way of punishing hubris. We are seeing a repetition of the 1956 Suez Crisis, the exact moment when the British Empire, drunk on its own past glory, tried to assert control over a vital waterway, only to be humiliated and forced to retreat by the changing realities of global power. Today it is Washington playing the role of the fading British Empire, clinging to the fantasies of the past while the future closes in around it. This blockade is not just about an island. It is a demonstration that the era of unipolar capability is over. The U.S. is trying to fight a 21st century conflict with a 20th century mindset, and the results are catastrophic. They thought they could simply print money, ship weapons, and maintain their dominance through proxy chaos. Instead, they have accelerated the very thing they fear most, the consolidation of a multipolar order that refuses to bow to Western coercion. The $11.1 billion deal was supposed to be a shield. Instead, it became the trigger for a geopolitical earthquake that is shaking the foundations of the post-World War II order. We are watching the gears of the American war machine grind to a halt, not because they lack firepower, but because they lack the legitimacy and the leverage to use it. The separatists they claim to support are now trapped in a cage of Washington's own making, used as pawns in a game that the U.S. no longer has the skill to play. The machinery of American power is built on 3 pillars: the supremacy of the dollar, the reach of its sanctions regime, and the overwhelming dominance of its media narratives. For the last 30 years, whenever a nation stepped out of line, Washington simply had to pull one of these levers to crush them. But what we are witnessing in the Taiwan Strait right now is the catastrophic failure of all 3 mechanisms simultaneously. It is a system failure of the highest order. The establishment in D.C. immediately tried to deploy their narrative weapon, flooding the airways with stories of unprovoked aggression and calling for the international community to condemn Beijing. In the past, this would have worked. The world would have fallen in line. But today, the global south is silent. The BRICS nations are watching with folded arms. They see the $11.1 billion arms package for exactly what it was, a provocation, designed to turn an island into a prickly porcupine aimed at the Chinese mainland. The narrative control is evaporated because the world has access to alternative information flows. They see the hypocrisy of a nation that supplies bombs to level Gaza, now pretending to care about the sanctity of human life in East Asia. The moral high ground has crumbled beneath American feet, and without it, their diplomatic shouting is just noise. Then comes the economic weapon, the so-called nuclear option of sanctions. As the blockade tightened, we heard the usual threats from the State Department. Severe consequences, economic isolation, and the threat of cutting off access to SWIFT. This is the playbook they used on Russia, and we all know how that turned out. It failed to destroy the ruble and instead accelerated the de-dollarization of the global energy market. Trying to use that same playbook on China is not just delusional, it is economic suicide. China is not a gas station, it is the factory of the world. It is the primary trading partner for over 120 nations. You cannot isolate the heart of the global supply chain without inducing a cardiac arrest in your own economy. Beijing knows this. They have spent the last decade explicitly insulating themselves against this exact scenario. They have built a fortress economy, stockpiling gold, energy, and grain at record levels. They have developed the CIPS payment system as a direct alternative to SWIFT. While Washington was busy printing trillions of dollars and debating pronouns, China was building a parallel nervous system for the global economy that is immune to American jurisdiction. The threat of sanctions today rings hollow because the target has already circumvented the mechanism. The weapon is jammed. But the most terrifying circumvention is happening on the water itself. This civilian armada tactic is a stroke of strategic genius that exploits the rigidity of the American military mind. The U.S. Navy is built for high-end kinetic warfare destroyers, carriers, missiles. It is a sledgehammer, but you cannot use a sledgehammer to catch a swarm of mosquitoes. By mixing thousands of civilian fishing vessels, maritime militia, and commercial ferries into the blockade line, Beijing has created a gray zone dilemma that the Pentagon's algorithms cannot solve. If an American destroyer fires on a fishing boat that is blocking its path, the United States instantly becomes the aggressor in the eyes of the world. They lose the information war in a nanosecond. If they do nothing, the blockade holds, and the island is strangled without a single shot being fired by a warship. It is a paralysis of power. The mighty Seventh Fleet is rendered impotent not by superior tonnage, but by superior strategy. They are prepared for a naval battle. They are not prepared for a people's war at sea. This reality has triggered absolute panic behind the closed doors of the White House and the Pentagon. I can tell you the mood in Washington is not one of resolve, it is one of confusion and dread. They are realizing that the disconnect button they used to rely on doesn't work anymore. They cannot turn off China's economy without destroying their own stock market. They cannot shoot their way through a civilian wall without triggering World War III. For the first time in living memory, the United States is facing a crisis where it has no good options, only varying degrees of humiliation. They assumed the mere presence of American flags would make Beijing back down. They assumed the $11.1 billion arms deal would act as a deterrent. Instead, it acted as an accelerant, proving that the U.S. understands nothing about the psychology of its adversary. They have poked the dragon expecting it to flinch and are now horrified to find that the dragon was waiting for this exact excuse to close its jaws. The phone lines between D.C. and allies in Tokyo and Seoul are burning. But the message coming back is not one of blind support. It is one of deep existential anxiety. The vassals are realizing the emperor has no clothes, and more importantly, no shield that can protect them from the consequences of American recklessness. This brings us to the ugly, festering heart of the matter. The moral trap that the West has set for itself, and by extension, for the people of Taiwan. We must strip away the diplomatic pleasantries and look at the naked reality of what American friendship actually costs in the 21st century. The establishment in Washington loves to wrap its geopolitical ambitions in the soaring rhetoric of democracy promotion and human rights. They stand at podiums and lecture the world about the sanctity of self-determination. But let us be brutally honest, this is not a defense of democracy. It is a business transaction. It is the cynical use of ideological branding to disguise the machinery of resource extraction and strategic containment. When the United States signed that $11.1 billion arms deal, they weren't sending a lifeline. They were fitting a suicide vest onto the island. The porcupine strategy that American think tanks are so fond of discussing is in reality a policy of national martyrdom. They are not training the local forces to win. They are training them to die slowly enough to inflict damage on China, while the United States watches from a safe distance, calculating the return on investment. We have seen this movie before. We know exactly how it ends because the United States has left a trail of smoking ruins across the Middle East and North Africa that serves as a permanent indictment of its foreign policy. Look at Iraq. In 2003, we were told that the invasion was a moral imperative to remove a dictator and plant the seeds of liberty in the Arab world. The media cheered, the missiles flew, and the regime fell. And what was the harvest? 1 million dead civilians, a nation fractured into sectarian warlordism, the rise of ISIS, and a generation traumatized by chaos. The democracy they promised was delivered in the form of depleted uranium and black sites. The American corporations got the oil contracts, the defense contractors got their billions, and the Iraqi people got a living hell. Then look at Libya. This is perhaps the most chilling parallel for what is happening today. The United States and its NATO allies intervened under the banner of responsibility to protect. They claimed they were preventing a massacre. They bombed the infrastructure, destroyed the government, and celebrated the brutal murder of Muammar Gaddafi on live television. Hillary Clinton laughed and said, "We came, we saw, he died." But who is laughing now? Libya, once the most prosperous nation in Africa with the highest standard of living, is now a broken, lawless wasteland where human beings are literally sold in open-air slave markets. That is the legacy of American intervention. That is the freedom they delivered. They turned a functioning state into a failed state and then walked away, washing their hands of the blood. And now they want to apply this same liberation model to East Asia. They are willing to turn the Taiwan Strait into the next Syria, the next Ukraine. The cynics in the State Department have calculated that a destroyed, burning island is just as useful to them as a free one, as long as that destruction hurts Beijing. They are practicing the doctrine of fighting to the last local. We saw it in Kabul when the U.S. abandoned its allies overnight, leaving people falling from the landing gear of C-17 seconds in a desperate bid to escape the very chaos Washington created. We are seeing it in Ukraine, where a generation of young men is being fed into a meat grinder to weaken Russia, while BlackRock prepares to buy up the agricultural land for pennies on the dollar. This is not alliance. This is predation. The $11.1 billion arms package is not a shield. It is a curse. It ensures that if conflict comes, it will be prolonged, bloody, and catastrophic for the civilians caught in the crossfire. The hypocrisy is so thick you could choke on it. The same American officials who are currently hyperventilating about sovereignty in the Taiwan Strait are the same people who are funding and arming the absolute obliteration of Gaza. Where is the concern for human rights there? Where is the rules-based international order when hospitals and refugee camps are being leveled with American-supplied munitions? It doesn't exist. The rules-based order is a myth. It is a fairy tale told to gullible voters to justify the maintenance of an empire. The rules apply only to America's enemies. They never apply to America itself or its clients. The global South sees this double standard with crystal clarity. They see that when the U.S. talks about international law, it is really talking about American permission. If you obey, you are a partner. If you disobey, you are a rogue state. This moral bankruptcy has consequences. You cannot act as the world's arsonist and then pretend to be the fire chief. The trust is gone. The soft power that once allowed the U.S. to lead by example has evaporated, replaced by the hard power of coercion and threats. But coercion has a shelf life. When you sanction a third of the world's population, when you weaponize your currency, when you use human rights as a battering ram to topple governments you dislike, you eventually force the world to build an immune system against you. That is what this blockade represents. It is the antibody response to the virus of American interventionism. China is looking at the ruins of Iraq, the slave markets of Libya, and the graveyards of Syria and saying, not here, never here. The Justice Mission is a rejection of the American model of chaos. It is a statement that the era of Western powers carving up the world under the guise of morality is over. The U.S. has fallen into its own trap. By framing every conflict as a moral crusade between good and evil, they have left themselves no room for diplomacy, no room for compromise. They have painted themselves into a corner where they must either start a world war to protect their lies or watch their entire narrative collapse in real time. And looking at the confusion in Washington today, it seems the collapse has already begun. But we must broaden our lens, because to view this blockade merely as a regional dispute over a map is to miss the tectonic shift occurring beneath our feet. This is not a localized incident. It is the opening salvo of a global reckoning. We are witnessing the unfolding of asymmetric warfare on a planetary scale, a style of conflict the Pentagon is woefully ill-equipped to fight. While the American generals are obsessed with kinetic metrics, tonnage, range, yield, Beijing is playing a game of systemic strangulation. This is what I call reciprocal escalation, but it is happening in domains the West has foolishly neglected. The moment that $11.1 billion arms package was signed, the United States didn't just challenge the Chinese military. It challenged the entire axis of the emerging multipolar world. Look at the timing. This operation isn't happening in a vacuum. It is coordinated. While the U.S. Navy is frantically redeploying assets to the Pacific, stretching its supply lines to the breaking point, look at what is happening elsewhere. Russia is pressing its advantage in Eastern Europe, knowing that Washington cannot sustain a two-front high-intensity conflict. Iran is consolidating its influence in the Strait of Hormuz. North Korea is signaling aggression. This is the nightmare scenario that strategists like Brzezinski warned about decades ago, a grand coalition of Eurasian powers, united not by ideology, but by a shared existential need to dismantle American hegemony. The U.S. has unified its adversaries by trying to contain everyone. They have been contained by everyone. The most devastating weapon in this new war isn't a hypersonic missile, it is the supply chain. The Taiwan Strait is the jugular vein of the global economy. 50% of the world's container ships pass through this waterway. More importantly, it is the home of the Silicon Shield, the advanced semiconductor foundries that power everything from your smartphone to the F-35 fighter jet. By encircling the island with a civilian armada, China hasn't just surrounded a territory. They have taken the global technology sector hostage. This is the ultimate asymmetry. The United States can print dollars, but it cannot print microchips. If this blockade hardens, if the flow of silicon stops, the Western economy enters a cardiac arrest that makes the 2008 financial crisis look like a minor hiccup. We are talking about the immediate cessation of automobile manufacturing, the collapse of consumer electronics, and the grounding of the aerospace industry. Beijing knows this. They are leveraging the West's addiction to cheap, efficient supply chains against it. They are betting that when the stock markets in New York and London begin to bleed, the corporate oligarchs who actually run the Western democracies will force the politicians to back down. It is a siege of the wallet, not just the fortress. And where is the international community that the U.S. claims to lead? It is fracturing. The global South Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia is watching this spectacle and making a calculated choice. They are not rushing to sanction China. They are not cutting ties. Why would they? They see the writing on the wall. They see a declining empire flailing about, demanding loyalty it can no longer purchase, and a rising power that offers infrastructure, trade, and non-interference. The diplomatic isolation of the United States is becoming palpable. When Washington calls for a coalition, they get a conference call with the G7, a shrinking club of indebted nations, while the rest of the world meets at BRICS summits to discuss trading in local currencies. This blockade is accelerating the flight from the dollar. Every nation now realizes that if they hold U.S. dollars, they are funding the very weapon systems that destabilize the world. The weaponization of the financial system has backfired. The response to Operation Justice Mission isn't a global condemnation of China. It is a global hedging of bets against America. But let's bring this down from the stratosphere of geopolitics to your kitchen table, because this is where the betrayal is most personal. You, the citizen, are the one who will pay the price for this imperial hubris. The establishment doesn't care about inflation. They have assets to protect them. But for the working class, this geopolitical adventurism is a death sentence for your standard of living. That $11.1 billion, that was your tax money. It wasn't spent on your crumbling bridges, your failing schools, or your health care. It was transferred directly into the bank accounts of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, and then shipped overseas to provoke a war that will drive up the cost of every single item you buy. When the shipping lanes close, the price of gas goes up, the price of food goes up, the price of technology skyrockets. We are staring down the barrel of hyperstagflation, a stagnant economy ravaged by soaring prices, driven by the disruption of the global trade network. This is the hidden tax of empire. You are being asked to subsidize a foreign policy that makes you poorer and less safe. The national security of the homeland is actually being degraded by these actions. By overextending the military abroad, the U.S. leaves itself vulnerable at home. By weaponizing the dollar, they destroy the purchasing power of your savings. By provoking nuclear-armed superpowers, they gamble with the lives of your children. The narrative that we must fight them over there so we don't have to fight them here is the biggest lie of the century. The truth is, by fighting them over there, the U.S. establishment's bringing the economic ruin right to your front door. The blowback is not just diplomatic, it is domestic. The social contract is breaking. The people are realizing that their government is more interested in maintaining a global empire than in serving the national interest. This blockade is a mirror, and in it we see the ugly truth. The greatest threat to our prosperity isn't a foreign capital. It is the unhinged ambition of our own ruling class. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is an observable, quantifiable reality. The events unfolding in the Taiwan Strait are merely the symptoms of a terminal condition that has been rotting the American body politic for decades. We have arrived at the inevitable intersection where the irresistible force of historical change meets the immovable object of American delusion. The United States is now faced with the most critical choice in its 250-year history, a choice that will determine whether it survives this century as a prosperous republic or collapses as a failed hegemon. The choice is stark. Adapt to reality or cling to the illusion. Adaptation requires humility. It requires the wisdom to accept that the unipolar moment was a historical anomaly, a brief flicker of time that is now extinguished. It means acknowledging that we share this planet with other ancient civilizations, China, Russia, India, Persia, who have their own interests, their own red lines, and their own destiny, and who will no longer accept being treated as vassals or rebellious provinces. It means returning to a foreign policy of restraint, diplomacy, and realism, where we prioritize the well-being of our own citizens over the vanity of global domination. But the tragedy of our time is that the ruling class in Washington seems incapable of this humility. They are choosing the second path, the path of illusion. They are doubling down on the myth of American exceptionalism, a dangerous religious dogma which states that the laws of history do not apply to the United States. They believe they can print infinite money without inflation, sanction the world without isolation, and wage endless war without defeat. This hubris is the classical definition of a Greek tragedy. By refusing to share power, they are losing it entirely. By trying to strangle China with an $11.1 billion arms deal, they have forced China to break the chains. The Operation Justice mission is not just a military maneuver. It is a declaration of independence from the Western order. It is a signal that the global South has found its voice and its spine. The civilian armada swarming those waters represents the rise of the global majority, the billions of people who are tired of being lectured, bombed, and sanctioned by a capital that cannot even keep its own subways safe or its own borders secure. The blockade will likely end one way or another, but the world that existed before it is gone forever. The psychological barrier has been breached. The world has seen that the emperor cannot protect his pawns. The veil of invincibility has been pierced by fishing boats and ferries. If the United States continues on this trajectory of blind escalation, demanding submission from peer competitors, we are not heading toward victory. We are sleepwalking toward a catastrophe that will make the fall of Rome look like a gentle transition. The gears of history are grinding forward, indifferent to our desires. We can either learn to operate within the machinery of a multipolar world, or we can be crushed by it. The justice mission is the final warning bell. The question is anyone in Washington sober enough to hear it? If you want to understand the geopolitical reality that the mainstream media refuses to show you, you need to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. The algorithm suppresses these truths because they threaten the narrative of the establishment. Share this video to break the blockade on information, and I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I have two questions for you today. First, do you believe the $11.1 billion arms deal made the world safer, or did it guarantee a future conflict? And second, are we witnessing the definitive end of the American empire in 2025? I will be reading your answers. Stay skeptical.